Welcome back to Beyond the Uniform. I'm Justin Asiri, and my goal is to help military veterans and their families thrive in their civilian career. Today is episode number 281 with Lockheed Martin's Chuck Hollingsworth.
I would just like to encourage them to know that you have more to offer than you may think, and to think deeply about that, to be encouraged in that. It's just like a fish swimming in water. You don't even see, you don't understand the water you're in. But I'm here to tell you now, with a few years on the other side, that you have a significant value to offer any company. This is just about finding the right fit.
After a 30-year Navy career, Chuck made his transition into the corporate world. We talk about what that transition was like and how leadership differs inside of the military versus outside the military. We talk about his role in corporate strategy and business development at Lockheed Martin and how the collateral jobs we do in the military may play a bigger role in our career choice than we often realize. We talk about the breadth of skills veterans bring to their employers and how to communicate this in interviews. We also take a detailed look at the incredible breadth of opportunities at Lockheed Martin and what they're doing to support the military community. Lockheed Martin employs over 22,000 veterans, and just last year, in 2018, they had over 19,000 connections with veterans, with 170 events and 3,500 veterans hired in just 1 year. As always, at beyondtheuniform.org, you'll find links in the show notes for this episode to all the resources we discuss, as well as a whole host of information about Chuck. He's got an incredibly impressive background. Special thanks to all of those of you who follow the link in the show notes to leave a positive review on Apple Podcasts and iTunes. Special thanks to Ked267, who wrote, "I'm transitioning out of the military this summer after spending the past 6 years in the Coast Guard. I wish I had found this podcast sooner. It's an absolute goldmine of practical advice and knowledge. Thank you, Justin, for all that you do." Thank you, Ked267, and all of those of you who have left positive reviews on iTunes. So with that, let's dive in to my conversation with Chuck. Well, joining me today in Rockville, Maryland, my guest is Chuck Hollingsworth. Chuck, welcome to Beyond the Uniform.
Thanks, Justin. It's good to be with you.
So for listeners, this is a very abbreviated bio, but there's a lot of links for Chuck in the show notes at beyondtheuniform.org for this episode. Chuck is part of Lockheed Martin's corporate strategy and business development group, where he focuses on strategic customer relationship development, corporate orders growth, and focus programs, and several functional development courses, such as the Doing Business Overseas Institute. He started out, like me, at the United States Naval Academy, after which he served as an officer in the Navy for over 30 years. This includes serving as Chief of Staff to the Chief of Naval Air Training, with oversight of all undergraduate Navy flight training, as well as the Navy Flight Demonstration Team, the Blue Angels. It also includes being a responder to support in the aftermath of the USS Cole attack. It includes being immediately after 9/11 dispatched to Islamabad, Pakistan, where at the Pakistan government's request, he served as the principal U.S. military liaison to coordinate combat operations through Pakistan into Afghanistan. Chuck has worked at Lockheed Martin for over 5 years. So Chuck, maybe to kick things off, could you walk us through, I mean, you had a very full, very rich career in the Navy, and then at the end of that 30-year period, what was the job search like, and what ultimately led you to Lockheed Martin?
Yeah, great question. I tell you, you're right. It was a wonderful career. I felt fortunate to have had it, but it all comes to an end, right? For everybody, at some point, you get to that time, that day. And for me, it was really about trying to initially scope the problem, right? Because you get to that point in your career, you feel like there's so many options out there of commercial, aerospace and defense, consulting, your small business. And for me, it was a series of steps beginning to scope that down. I decided that I really enjoyed being involved in the aerospace and defense industry. And so that was really the first step, was scoping it down to that. that I would be interested in trying to continue to serve in a way um, uh, to to be involved in the industry that I felt like was supporting the men and women on the front lines. Once I made that decision, that clarified the space quite a bit. I was able to focus to a handful of companies. And from there, it really became about, as we all hear, the networking, the calling up those friends that you know that are out there. I think one of my biggest lessons learned from that is that you got to let people know.
Mm.
You got to let people know you're ready. You got to let people know about your timing and that what you're interested in, because there's people out there willing to help. But even your good friends don't know exactly what your timing is, right? And so I called up some friends. I called up some former bosses. It turned out a couple of them worked for Lockheed Martin. They were interested in helping me find a way to get an interview, and it all flowed from there.
That's great. And I just want to call out two things for listeners. First of all, I love how you started by scoping out. I want to remind listeners the power of saying no. And I think that oftentimes we as veterans approach this as I'll do anything, I'll go anywhere, I'll be a jack of all trades. That actually makes the job harder. And the power of Chuck taking the time to do that heavy lifting, that soul searching to figure out and narrow down the scope of what he was looking at made this process infinitely easier for him. And then the other thing I love about what you said is you got to let people know. And I think that that can be uncomfortable for us as veterans. But again, the power of taking the time to figure out what you want and then sharing that with people when you're in conversation, letting them know that you're leaving the military, what you're thinking of, what you're looking for, and in many ways as possible, getting that word out there. Because one of the trends I've seen in these interviews is often that first job comes from a friend of a friend or someone who knows someone else, and they're not going to be able to make that connection if you don't, as Chuck said, let people know what you're doing and what you're thinking about. So I love that you called that out, Chuck.
Right, and to me, one of the most freeing elements or tips that I was given early on, because you're right, we're not that great. We come from a service that values humility, right? So a lot of times we're not that great at selling ourselves and a little uncomfortable with some of those initial calls. But the idea that you can free yourself up to just have informational interviews, right? Informational discussions. I'm not asking you for a job. I just want to pick your brain on your own transition,
Mm-hmm.
what it is you're doing. I'm trying to learn to help me understand the kaleidoscope of jobs that are out there. So I want to talk to you about yours. That is easier to do, right? And you can have those conversations. And it's just the nature of relationships that I think one out of three or four of those conversations is going to lead to something else.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to say, you know what? You've made me think of something. Let me connect you to so and so because I think they're looking. And so, to me, the idea of the informational interview was key.
I think that's great, and I hope that listeners who have listened to a couple episodes, that's what we're trying to role model on the show. And hopefully you can see, I mean, let's say even for this conversation with Chuck, it took reaching out, getting on his schedule, took 15, 20 minutes of looking at his background, preparing in advance, thinking of what I wanted to ask about, and then being present in the conversation and just making it a conversation. I hope that that's very accessible for listeners. That's all these informational interviews are. It's connecting with someone, asking some questions, doing a little bit of homework beforehand, and that's it. And it's a numbers game. Just doing that, at the very least, you're going to learn a lot. But that's also how you start to expand your network. And as Chuck said, you might, find someone who knows someone who needs someone like you, and you never know where this leads.
That's right. That's right.
What about before we go too much further? So you work in Lockheed's corporate strategy and business development department. If you were to bump into someone who's currently on active duty and they said, "Hey, Chuck, what do you do for a living?" How do you explain to them your role and what sort of things that you do?
But for me, I would liken it, being here at corporate headquarters for Lockheed is not unlike being at the Pentagon on the major staff of a service, right? Because I'm not down within the tactical business areas that are actually doing the building and selling. I have a more of a overreach type position here. Of course, corporate strategy and business development are ultimately about orders and sales for the company. But my personal role happens to be more about the professional development of the business development force.
Mm.
So I sit here at a headquarters function. I look out at about 1,500 or so of folks that are in the BD, the business development world, and I'm looking at how I can better facilitate their own professional development and be better in their role. So it's interesting. It's not unlike some of the roles that I had in the Navy.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, my last role in the Navy, there was the Chief of Staff of Aviation Training. That's what I was doing, right? I was getting the aircraft, the tools, and equipment for people to get through flight school and pin wings on their chest. So in a way, I'm in a parallel to that, but it just happens to be in a corporate environment.
That's great, and I hope for listeners you realize. I mean, you should look in the show notes, and it was difficult to trim down Chuck's bio to a quick soundbite at the start. But if you look at his background, you'll see in a 30-year career, he did so many different aspects within the military, and what it sounds like what you found, Chuck, it's taking one piece of that service. It's not like this is dealing with ships. It's not like it's dealing with planes. It's not like it's directly dealing with a lot of what his experience was in the military. And a good portion of his experience included training, educating, supporting, and that's what he's doing now in the civilian sector. And sometimes I just want to call this out because sometimes I feel like listeners feel like I did X in the military, I need to do X outside of the military. And what you said, Chuck, it's a great reminder to listeners that we in the military, we do so many different things. And to be able to recognize that, like, hey, leading a group of 1,500 business development professionals, that's a massive undertaking. That's not something that Chuck would have been able to do straight out of the Naval Academy. That was building blocks to get there and increasing the amount of oversight he had in the military to now that he can leverage that skill in a civilian context. He's teaching something very different than he taught in the military, but I'm imagining, Chuck, you're using a lot of the skills that you developed in the military to bring that to bear into that role.
No, you're exactly right. So, sometimes I think we veterans, we don't even capture the breadth of what it is that the military has given us. And you're exactly right. For me, believe it or not, when I came up to interview for this job, it was a blind interview. I didn't know the position that I was interviewing for. They just wanted to talk.